This is our second of 3 weeks in the book of Hebrews. And as I said last week, Hebrews is this enigmatic, mysterious book. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know who they wrote it to. We don't know what they wrote it for, what the purpose of it was. We don't know what it is. Is it a treatise? Is it a sermon? Is it an epistle? It doesn't sort of like fit anything, like any model or form. But if we know anything, whatever it is, whoever wrote it, whatever they wrote it for, it's about faith. It's about inspiring faith in everyone who reads this book, whether it's 2,000 years ago or whether it's today. The 11th chapter of Hebrews that we were in last week and that we're in for the most part this week is the literary high point. It's this litany of the saints of the Hebrew Bible with this drumbeat of by faith, by faith, by faith. It begins by faith Abel, and then by faith Enoch, and by faith Noah, by faith Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Esau, by faith Joseph, by faith Moses, by faith the people of Israel, by faith Rahab the prostitute, by faith Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. It's this great family of people of faith, the heroes, the great and the small heroes of the Hebrew Bible. And we're reminded that they are people of faith and that their faith wasn't just a faith like in their head where they had like a litany of beliefs, but they had this faith and then they did things with it by faith. Faith is like an engine. It's a fuel that causes us to act. And just like their faith propelled them forward, we are called to have a faith that propels us forward too. So that one day, future generations could look back and say, yes, by faith, Enoch and Abel and Noah and Moses, but also by faith, Rick did such and such. And then the author of Hebrews ends this great litany, this rhetorical high point of the book by saying, therefore, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. It's not even that these heroes of faith lived a long time ago and did great stuff. They still surround us. It's like when life is hard, when faith is hard, we are not alone. We are surrounded by their life and witness. So I want to tell a story about someone in the great cloud of witnesses. This past week, the church commemorated a man named Jonathan Myrick Daniels. And sometimes the church remembers saints that lived like a long time ago, and sometimes the church remembers saints in our own day. And Jonathan Myrick Daniels is someone who's close to us. He was born in 1939 in New Hampshire. He was born into a Congregationalist family, as a lot of people in New England are Congregationalist Christians. But as a young man, he was drawn to the ritual nature of the Episcopal Church, and so he became an Episcopalian. He went off to Virginia Military Institute, and he didn't fall away completely from his faith, but it stopped being like a focus of his life. After VMI, he went to study English at Harvard, and Easter 1962, while studying at Harvard, he went to Easter services at the Church of the Advent in Boston, which if you've ever been, is this like super high ritualistic Episcopal church incense and bells and singing and vestments and statues. It's a pretty awe-inspiring place. And he has this incredible religious experience. Like he feels that like God is right there with him. And he feels like God is calling him into ministry. To be a priest. And so he ends up leaving Harvard and ends up going basically across the street to Episcopal Divinity School, Episcopal Theological Seminary which is right there in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So he's studying there in the mid-60s. And of course, as we all know, the mid-60s were a kind of tumultuous time, right? Lots of arguments about race, discrimination, voting, school integration, busing, the whole thing. In 1965, a group of mostly black protesters were in Selma, Alabama, protesting, and were met kind of brutally by the Alabama State Police. And the whole nation watched what happened play out on their television screens, and it was brutal. And in the wake of that, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called for clergy of the North and of all the United States to come to Selma. And Jonathan Myrick Daniels kind of felt like he should go, but he wasn't sure. And so he went to evening prayer, and evening prayer in the Episcopal tradition almost always includes the Magnificat, which is the Song of Mary, which Mary sings in the beginning of Luke's Gospel when she meets up with her cousin Elizabeth. So this is from Jonathan's journal. He says, "My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Savior." That's a direct quote from the Magnificat. "I had come to evening prayer as usual that evening, and as usual I was singing the Magnificat with the special love and reverence I have always felt for Mary's glad song. He hath showed strength with his arm. As the lovely hymn of the God-bearer continued, I found myself peculiarly alert, suddenly straining toward the decisive, luminous, spirit-filled moment that would, in retrospect, remind me of others, particularly one at Easter 3 years ago. Then it came. He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. He hath filled the hungry with good things. I knew then that I must go to Selma. The Virgin's song was to grow more and more in the weeks ahead." So he has this incredible experience of God. Now he feels like God is calling him to Selma. So he goes. And while there, he has another kind of incredible experience. I want to read it. It's a little bit longer, but I think it's valuable and inspiring. So in his journal, he writes this: "After a week-long, rain-soaked vigil, we stood face to face with the Selma police. I stood for a change in the front rank, ankle deep in an enormous puddle. To my immediate right were high school students, for the most part, and further to the right were a swarm of clergymen. My end of the line surged forward at one point, led by a militant Episcopal priest whose temper, as usual, was at combustion point. Thus I found myself only inches from a young policeman. The air crackled with tension and open hostility. Emma Jean, a sophomore in the Negro High School, called my name from behind. I reached back for her hand to bring her up to the front rank, but she did not see. Again, she asked me to come back. My determination had become infectiously savage, and I insisted that she come forward. I would not retreat. Again, I reached for her hand and pulled her forward. The young policeman spoke. "You're dragging her through the puddle. You ought to be ashamed for treating a girl like that." Flushing, I had forgotten the puddle. I snarled something at him about whose fault it really was that managed to be both defensive and self-righteous. We matched baleful glances and then looked away, and then came a moment of shattering internal quiet in which I felt shame, indeed, and a kind of reluctant love for the young policeman. I apologized to Emma Jean, and then it occurred to me to apologize to him and to thank him. Though he looked away in contempt, I was not altogether sure I blamed him. I had received a blessing I would not forget. Before long, the kids were singing, "I love so-and-so, I love so-and-so." One of my friends asked the young policeman for his name. His name was Charlie. When we sang for him, "I love Charlie," he blushed and then smiled in a truly sacramental mixture of embarrassment and pleasure and shyness. Soon the young policeman looked relaxed. We all lit cigarettes, in a couple of instances from a common match, and small groups of kids and policemen clustered to joke or talk cautiously about the situation. Isn't that incredible? I mean, he's self-aware. He's aware of sort of the internal motivations that are going on inside of him. He becomes aware that he's there not just to love his black brothers and sisters, but he's there also to love the policemen like Charlie. I mean, it's just, well, it's pretty amazing. So they're there for a while, and then they realize that all the Northerners are going home. And they felt unsettled about this because it wasn't like the work was done. And they kind of felt like if they went home then, they would be like tourists on holiday. And so he and this small group of friends decided they needed to stay. He ended up going back to Boston to get permission from the seminary to continue his studies at a distance in Alabama. He goes back to Alabama, and he lives with black families. Some of the black families that he lives with get threats from the authorities for having him live with them, and so he has to go off to somewhere else. He forges incredible relationships with the families that he lives with. He's doing work not just in Selma, but in the rural, impoverished areas, seeing people live in absolute squalor, ministering to them, helping them know that they are loved by him and by God. He's working to integrate the local Episcopal Church, which was harder than he thought. He ended up being with a group of clergy who were picketing outside the diocesan offices in Alabama, saying that the Bishop of Alabama was for segregated churches. Eventually, he and a small group, he and 3 others, are arrested, and they're thrown into jail, in this little like rural town. And they're there for a week. The 3 of them, there's him, the seminarian, there's a priest, there's a teenage girl, and there's someone else. And they make a pact that none of them are going to leave until there is bail for all of them. They're sticking together. And then after being there a week, they are mysteriously let go. All of a sudden, like no one had paid bail, no one dropped charges. It was just all of a sudden, one minute they're in the jail, the next minute the doors are being flinged open and they're being let go. And they know that this isn't good, that it didn't feel right. And so they left the jail and they immediately went into a grocery store, and there was some kind of commotion, and the teenage girl went to the door of the grocery store and she pulled the door open. There was a man standing there with a shotgun pointed at the girl. And what happens next is a bit of a fog and is unclear, but somehow Jonathan Myrick Daniels inserted himself between the man with the gun and the teenage girl. And then Jonathan Myrick Daniels is shot in the stomach and dies almost instantly there on the spot. He writes this a couple days before his death. And the words here are sort of, they're like prescient. I lost fear in Alabama when I began to know in my bones and sinews that I had been truly baptized into the Lord's death and resurrection. That in the only sense that really matters, I am already dead, and my life is hid with Christ in God. I began to lose self-righteousness when I discovered the extent to which my behavior was motivated by worldly desires and by the self-seeking messianism of Yankee deliverance. The point is simply, of course, that one's motives are usually mixed, and one had better know it. As Judy and I said the daily offices, that's the daily prayers day by day, we became more and more aware of the living reality of the invisible communion of saints, of the beloved community in Cambridge who were saying the offices too, of the ones gathered around a near distant throne in heaven, who blend with theirs our unfaltering songs of prayer and praise, with them, with black men and white men, with all of life, in him whose name is above all the names that the races and nations shout, whose name is itself the song which fulfills and ends all songs. We are indelibly, unspeakably one. I've been thinking a lot about Jonathan over this past week. The date that he was arrested was August 14th, whose anniversary was this last week, and the date that he died is August 20th, which is this Monday. And perhaps you'll think of Jonathan Myrick Daniels too. There's a kind of wonderful little documentary that's done on his life, and I'll put a link to that on our church Facebook page. I highly recommend it. But the thing that strikes me about particularly what he wrote after, right before he died, was this sense that the work he was doing was hard. It was daunting. It was scary. It made him think about life and death. And it would cost him his life. And yet he realized that he was not alone. That there was this great communion of saints. And it was the communion of saints in heaven. It was like the communion of saints from the 11th chapter of Hebrews. It's Abel and Enoch and Noah and Moses and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Rahab and Samson and David and Peter, James and John, and all the ones who have saint in front of their names and have halos on their head and are memorialized in stained glass windows, but also the saints that he knew in Cambridge, his friends, his fellow students, his colleagues, his family, the people whose faces and names that he knew personally, the people he loved, people who loved him. They were in somehow with him. That's what it means to be in the great cloud of witnesses, to be surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, to be supported by their love, to be supported by their prayers. This great family of faith, of people who believe in Jesus, and people who believe in Jesus enough to live not just with faith, but by faith. People like Jonathan Myrick Daniels. And so I hope you do think about him, but I also hope you think about your great cloud of witnesses. When you're having a tough time, when your life is hard, and you're able to come to the realization that you're not alone, who's with you? Who's surrounding you? Who's lifting you up? Who's holding you up so that you can live by faith?